Welcome back. This is the 6 Days of Genesis, a curriculum series based on the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis. And we're on the 3rd session now, and the 3rd session is going to be about the Bible's astronomy. But before we get into this session, let's just recap where we've been so far. In our first session, we laid down our presuppositions, our starting point. We showed that it's absolutely vital to believe what the Bible says is true. And the Bible makes clear that God made the world in 6 literal 24-hour periods some 6,000 years ago. And it's important to start with that. A good friend of mine back in the United Kingdom called Dr. Monty White, who's been speaking on the subject of creation and evolution for even longer than I have, was doing a talk one time. And a lady, a very posh lady from somewhere in the home counties of England, if you know what that's like, very, very well-to-do lady came to speak to him afterwards and said, I don't limit God to to saying that he had to make things in 6 days. God could have made things in any length of time he liked. I'm not going to limit God to say that they had to be exactly 6 days. And Monty's reply was, I don't limit God either, he says. I limit myself to believing what God actually says, that what God says is what he meant. Well, she says, God could have made the world in millions of years, couldn't he? So Monty thought he would pursue this. He said, yes, actually, God could have made the world in 6 million years, couldn't he? Yes, she said. In fact, he says, God could have made the world in 6,000 years, couldn't he? Yes, she says. In fact, he says, God could have made the world in 6 seconds, couldn't he? Yes, she says. In fact, he said, God could have made the world in 6 minutes, couldn't he? Yes, she says. In fact, he said, God could have made the world in 6 days, couldn't he? Oh, no, he couldn't possibly have done that, no. The one thing that God couldn't possibly have done is the one that God said. Another good friend of mine who's a creation speaker, Carl Kirby, often says that people are saying, I've read what you said, God, now I'm going to tell you what you really meant. That's the truth, isn't it? Sobering to think of that. So that's what we looked at in the first session. To believe what God says is what actually happened. In the second session, we covered a lot of ground. We actually covered the whole of the first half of the week, days 1, 2, and 3. And we looked at the things that God made on those days. We saw that God made light, that he made everything, and he made light. And so the whole business about days came into being. You know, you must have read in Genesis 1 that there's evening, there's morning, the first day, and there's evening and morning, the second day, and so on. So we know that God made days. So all God needed to make days was to make light and to make the earth rotating. He didn't need a source for the light, because even today we can have light that exists without a source. If we turned all these lights off now, we switched the switches off, the light would still exist for a tiny fraction of a second. The point is that you wouldn't notice that because our eyes can't cope with that rapid a speed. But it would still exist for a small while, and we do have machines that would be able to detect it. For a little while after the switches were switched on, the light would still be there because it would be traveling from the light to where it's going. So God made light without a source, and he made the earth, and it was rotating. On day 2, he separated water from water, so he made the expanse of the universe, including the atmosphere. On day 3, he made the dry land. He set the sea in one place, and he made the dry land, and of course he made the plants. And we talked about plants being biological machines. Well, now we're going to look at the Bible's astronomy, because we're going to have a look at day 4 of creation. And most of what we're covering in these 6 sections is quite straightforward. So there will be a slight public health warning with this one, in that there will be something a little bit technical, okay? Please don't worry. I will give you a warning before I say anything really scientifically heavy. so that you can switch off and fall asleep for a few minutes, and then I'll wake you up once the heavy science has gone. Is that okay? So just bear with me, please. We're not going to do too much, but I will need to just mention a little bit on the subject of astronomy. On day 4 of creation, God made the sun, moon, and stars. And it's very interesting then to notice that the sun and the moon are not actually named in Genesis 1. Isn't that interesting? It talks about the greater light and the lesser light. And we know that he's talking about the sun and the moon, but they're not mentioned. Now, I do think it's significant, and there are a lot of Christians who think it's significant, but some think it's significant for the wrong reason. We talked in the previous session about the framework hypothesis. Those people who want to believe that Genesis is true in a sort of literal poetic sense, but not in a literal scientific sense. Have you come across those sort of people? They say they believe that Genesis is true, but they don't believe it's true. But they believe it's true, but not really true. I've debated theistic evolutionists on the media in the United Kingdom on occasions. One that sticks in my mind is a man called Dr. Dennis Alexander. Now, he is a scientist, biology lecturer at Cambridge University. He's also the director of the Faraday Institute, a grouping of scientists who are evangelical Christians, and that is also based at Cambridge University. And he is also an elder in what must be one of the largest conservative evangelical churches in England. So he speaks at all the major conservative evangelical conferences around the United Kingdom. And I had to debate this man on the BBC, on BBC Radio. BBC, as you probably know, stands for the Babylon Broadcasting Corporation. And one of the things that I noticed was that because Dr. Alexander believes in evolution and wants to believe the Bible is literally true, at one point in the debate I even felt that I had to accuse him of saying, well, his opinions are like theological contortionism. He has to engage in theological contortionism to hold the views that he holds. You know, I would almost rather that he was a complete liberal, that he said, well, I don't believe the Bible to be true. It would be much easier to understand, and at least it'd be something to get hold of. But sometimes discussing these things with theistic evolutionists who say that they're conservative evangelicals is a little bit like trying to nail Jell-O to the ceiling. Now, what the framework hypothesis people then say is that because the sun and the moon are not actually named in Genesis 1, that means that actually Genesis is really a polemic against the ancient Near Eastern paganism, ANE philosophy. Now, any of you who've done a little bit about history of theology may have come across the term ANE before. ANE, Ancient Near Eastern Philosophy, Babylonians, okay? That's what they're arguing, that Genesis is a polemic against paganism. This is the purpose for which Genesis has been written, they say, that it's arguing that there is only one God, not lots and lots of gods. And so therefore they're producing this creation story that says that. They then go further to argue that Genesis must have been written at that time when the people of Israel had been carried away, or rather the Jews, the kingdom of Judah had been carried away to Babylon. And that's when they say the book of Genesis was written. That it wasn't written by Moses, which of course Jesus believed, but that's irrelevant. That it was written as a polemic, and it was written as an allegory. Another well-known name that argues this is a man called N.T. Wright that you may have come across. N.T. Wright, or as he's known in private life, Bishop Tom Wright, because he used to be the Bishop of Durham in the north of England. And he is also a very well-known conservative evangelical scholar. Very well known. He's written Bible commentaries. It's very highly thought of in many conservative evangelical circles. And he maintains this whole point. He says, what Genesis means is this. When people read about Adam and Eve being thrown out of the Garden of Eden, what they would actually understand about that is that it's really Israel being thrown out of the land of Israel and taken into captivity. Therefore, Adam is not a real person. He is an allegory of Israel. And the Garden of Eden is an allegory of the promised land. Theological contortions that people have to make. Now, I would then say That I think Genesis actually is a polemic against paganism? Yes. But again, that doesn't stop it being true.
Yeah.
It's true and a polemic against paganism. Of course, it's maintaining that there is one God who is the creator, but it's true. And to be honest, a polemic against paganism loses its power if it's not true.
That's right. That's true.
You can't really argue against paganism with a fairy tale. It doesn't make sense. It would actually lose its value as an argument. So it's a much more powerful argument against paganism if it's true.
Yeah.
And that's what I would maintain. So let's actually see what it says then. We read then that God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night. Let them be signs and seasons for days and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. I think it's amazing in what an ordinary manner God mentions these things, because what is true about ancient Near Eastern philosophies is that they all worship the sun and the moon. And you can understand why many ancient civilizations worship the sun or the moon or both. A lot of them did. Because you can see the sun and you can see the moon, and what's more, both the sun and the moon have an effect on us. The sun has a very direct effect because it's what gives us the light and the heat during the day. So they would clearly want to worship what's giving them the sustenance that they need. Some of them very subtly would have realized that there's things about the moon, because the moon causes the tides and the moon causes the monthly cycles that we see in nature. So they worship the moon. And some of them worship the sun, some worship the moon, and some both. The Bible doesn't name them because they're not to be worshipped, because they are created things. And the whole point about the passage in Romans that we've quoted several times is that it tells us that what people have done wrong is that they've ceased to worship the Creator and they've started to worship the created things instead. The Bible cuts across that. So yes, this is a polemic against paganism because it's true, and only because it's true. Because God made the greater light and the lesser light, and he's not named them here in Genesis 1 because that's the whole point. The whole point is that God made them. They are part of his creation and are not to be worshipped. Now, of course, they're made for us and for our benefit. You see, it says here that they're to be lights, they're to be signs and seasons. And in fact, all our time scales do indeed come from these astronomical effects. That the day comes from the rotation of the Earth once every 24 hours. That the month comes from the orbit of the moon around the Earth, approximately once a month. And the year comes from the orbit of the Earth around the sun, once a year. And so we see that these astronomical effects are what gives us our timescales. But of course, by the way, there is one very important timescale which is not astronomical, and it's the week. And the only reason that we have the week is because that's the length of time that God took to create the world. And we have the week in celebration of the way that God made things. There's nothing in astronomy and there's nothing in nature that would suggest that we should have a week. And yet the week is absolutely essential. After the French Revolution, the Jacobins tried to install a 10-day week in France. Did you know that? And it couldn't work. They couldn't hold it. They couldn't make it stick. The Russian revolutionists, the Bolsheviks, did the same thing after the Russian Revolution. And they couldn't make that stick because it's not natural. We can't work with a 10-day week. It had to be a 7-day week because that's what works for us. And yet there's nothing actually in science for a week. The only thing that gives us the week is the Word of God.
Wow.
And it's there in our very makeup, the way that we are. So what's God done then as he makes these things? Well, it says that God set them, that is the stars. And isn't it interesting, by the way, that we look at the magnificence of the universe? The magnificence of the universe that we read elsewhere points to the glory of God. The Psalms tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God. So I'm not trying to do down the universe. The universe is beautiful and magnificent and huge and great. And yet in Genesis 1 it just says, oh, by the way, God made the stars as well.
Yeah.
Wow! Have you thought about that? God's making all these things, and it just says, as an afterthought, by the way, God made the stars. Did you know that? God made the stars as well. Yeah, I mustn't forget that. God made the stars. I'm being flippant, but it just shows you what the creativity of God is. Elsewhere in Psalms, we know that the universe is the work of his finger. He didn't even have to put much effort in. Less effort into making the stars than he put into making man. Just the work of his fingers. It's the stars. And God set those stars in the firmament of the heavens. And we talked about that in the last session. The stars are in the firmament. And it's important to understand that point, because the firmament refers to the entire expanse of space which is stretched. Now that's going to be important to us right now. And we know that the lights are there then to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And what God had made, he saw was good. You know, there is another creation myth around. That creation myth is called the Big Bang Theory. And what this creation myth says is that in the beginning there was nothing, and that nothing suddenly exploded. Now think about this. You see, is this actually a scientific statement? Does it sound scientific? Does it sound rational? The astronomer Heather Cooper, writing in a children's book called The Big Bang, said this: "It was a nothing so profound it defies human comprehension." Now, is that a statement of scientific opinion? It actually sounds more like a belief system. Brad Lemley said this. He said, "To the average person it might seem like nothing can happen in nothing, but to a quantum physicist, nothing is in fact something." Again, I ask, is that a scientific statement? Brad Lemley goes on to say that quantum theory also holds that a vacuum is subject to quantum uncertainties. This means that things can materialize out of the vacuum, although they tend to vanish back into it. This phenomenon has never been observed directly. Now, scientists love to use big words and flowery phrases, so let's just translate what he said into English. What he said is, things appear out of nothing, and then they disappear back into nothing. And oh, by the way, nobody's ever seen that happen. Now, if nobody's ever seen it happen, how do they know that it has happened? It actually is, again, not a statement of science. It is a statement of belief. Heather Cooper again said our universe probably came into existence not only from nothing, but from nowhere. Where are they getting these ideas from? Their ideas basically are being formulated because they do not want to accept that the God of the universe, the God who made the universe, has a claim on their lives. And you know, if we want to believe these things, even as Christians, what we are doing is we're saying that God is not actively involved in our lives, and God is not actively involved in the way that the universe operates. It's actually a form of practical atheism. It's really what the Apostle Paul was talking about when he was speaking on Mars Hill. And he said, well, you've got this unknown God, to paraphrase him. You've got this unknown God that you're worshipping to try and make sure that you worship him. But this God that you say you don't know, I know who he is. And he is the God who now commands men everywhere to repent. You see, because God made the universe, he does have a claim on our lives, and we have to face him one day. These ideas that he is not in charge are not statements of science, they're statements of belief to avoid believing in the God of the universe.
Come on.
If there's no God, there's no rules. Don't believe me? Listen to what this scientist says. Humans, not God, make the rules now, he says. We no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home and therefore obliged to make our behavior conform with a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. It's our creation now. We make the rules. We establish the parameters of reality. We create the world, and because we do, we no longer feel beholden to outside forces. We no longer have to justify our behavior, for we are now the architects of the universe. We are responsible to nothing outside ourselves, for we are the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Is that a statement of science? The blasphemous use of the Lord's Prayer shows that that is not a statement of science. That is his blasphemous, ungodly belief, because he does not want to acknowledge the God who created the universe. But hold on, people say, we've proved that the Big Bang happened, haven't we? Because of cosmic microwave background radiation. Oh, have we? What's cosmic microwave background radiation? Well, it was discovered in 1965 by Penzias and Wilson. What it means is this, that there is actually heat in the universe. Everywhere in the universe, there are actually stray atoms. The universe is not a perfect vacuum. There will be atoms at various points in the universe. Therefore, the universe is not actually at absolute zero Kelvin temperature. It's actually at a temperature of 2.75 Kelvin. Now, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. Kelvins are the same size as a degree Celsius, okay? And 2.75 kelvins, therefore, is 2.75 degrees above absolute zero. Without needing to know all the numbers, it means it's very, very cold, okay? Almost as cold as possible, but not quite as cold as possible, because as cold as possible would be 0 Kelvin. That would be no temperature. So there is a temperature in the universe, 2.75 degrees above absolute zero. Not much warmth, but just enough to stop it being zero. Now, the Big Bang theorists claim that that's left over from the explosion of the Big Bang. And the radiation that produces that temperature is at a 160.4 gigahertz range, which is the microwave range, the same range as your microwave ovens or your cell phones. Okay, that's the range that you've got. And that's the same in every part of the universe. It doesn't matter where you look in the universe, it's always the same. Now, there's a problem for the Big Bang theorists, because it's considered a proof of the Big Bang, but actually it's impossible by the Big Bang theory. And here's the problem concerned with it. You see, actually, if the Big Bang were true, then conditions would be random all over the universe. There would be pockets of heat here, pockets that were less hot here. And therefore, in order for the situation you have today, for the whole universe to be the same temperature throughout, it must have come to equilibrium. Heat must have moved from the slightly warmer areas to the slightly colder areas. Does that make sense? You know, I remember a friend of mine who was a physicist saying that he knew his wife understood him when she called out to him one day. She said, "Your roast beef and roast potatoes, gravy and ice cream are coming to thermal equilibrium." Ice cream warming up, the roast beef cooling down. They've got to get to the same temperature. If we have these various hotspots around the universe, then they must have been able to even themselves out, because the situation today, as we've just said, is that the cosmic microwave background radiation is the same in all parts of the universe. Now, the only way that this could have evened out, these temperature hotspots could have evened out, is by a process of radiation. And for heat to move by radiation, it must move in the form of infrared light, and therefore travel at the speed of light. Now, that being the case, we need to look at the age of the universe. You see, according to the Big Bang theory, the universe is only 13.7 billion years old. Only. Now, of course, I believe it's a lot less than that, but I'm talking about a completely different model. I'm talking about the biblical model. Under the Big Bang model, the universe is 13.7 billion years old. Just an interesting bunny trail, by the way. When I finished my teaching career, I used to be a school teacher until about 12 years ago. And at that time, the physics textbooks were telling the pupils that the universe was 12.3 billion years old. What that means, of course, is that the universe has got 1.4 billion years older in the last 12 years, which is quite a remarkable feat. However, if the universe is 13.7 billion years old, then in that case, light can only have travelled 13.7 billion light years to try and even out these hotspots. But the universe is a lot bigger than 13.7 billion light years across. The problem then is, It's a phenomenon that's been known by astrophysicists for a very long time, known as the horizon theory. The problem is that the universe is simply too big to have produced cosmic microwave background radiation and even temperature. So what they do is they've proposed a different theory. This theory says that a billionth of a second after the Big Bang, the universe must have fizzed very rapidly to expand rapidly. And then after 3 billionths of a second, it stopped that and it's just proceeded expanding in the way that it does today. That really means that the Big Bang theory has a bit of a fiddle factor at its heart, because what actual proof do they have for this rapid expansion that they call inflation? They have no proof whatsoever. When I was a university student many years ago, I had a Mini Clubman car. Now maybe many of you had cars similar to this. When it broke down, if something sort of fell, it seemed as if it was falling off it, then I would tie it back on with some string or attach it with some duct tape. That's really what the Big Bang theory is like. It's a theory that is held together with string and duct tape. It doesn't actually work, and it doesn't properly explain the whole business of cosmic microwave background radiation. Now, I mentioned that because you see it just proves that the Big Bang theory has a starlight problem that their theory can't explain. And I ought to mention that because I think we should admit at this point that we have a starlight problem too. And yet our starlight problem has some sensible answers to explain it. But this is the starlight problem in a nutshell. When did we see something that happens in the universe? When did we see it happen? And when we say when we saw it happen, we then need to ask, when did it really happen? What on earth am I on about here? Well, let me give you an example. There was a supernova happened in 1987, which was given the very imaginative name of supernova 1987A, just in case there was a second one. So this supernova was observed in a galaxy called the Lesser Cloud of Magellan, which is a sort of companion galaxy to our own galaxy. So it's in the larger, Magellanic Cloud, not the lesser one, the large Magellanic Cloud, and that is 200,000 light years away. So the question is, when did the supernova happen? Did it happen in 1987, or did it happen 200,000 years ago before 1987? When did it happen? And you see, this is a problem. How did light get from these distant objects across the universe if we believe that the universe is only 6,000 years old? Which I know is true because that's my presuppositional statement, is what the Bible teaches. Okay? I know it's true. So the issue here is not that I'm casting doubt on the Bible. I'm saying, what explanation can we come up with that works scientifically? Now, creationists have realized that this has been a problem for a long while, and they've come up with not one explanation, but 4. The explanation that creationists need to make is to look at something like the supernova 1987A, which was observed in 1987, and it's 200,000 light years away. So the question is, when did the supernova actually happen? Did it happen in 1987? Or did it happen 200,000 years ago? Bearing in mind, of course, that we read in Scripture that the universe is just 6,000 years old. So we have a problem, and creationists need to explain this problem. Now, there are very rational explanations for this problem, and we need to emphasize again that this is different from the Big Bang theory, where the Big Bang theory does not actually have rational explanations for its starlight problem, whereas creationists do. But I can't tell you definitively what the explanation is because there are a number of possibilities. In fact, traditionally there have been 4 explanations for the starlight and time problem. The first explanation is known as the mature starlight theory. The idea here is that God created the stars and he created the light coming from the stars en route to the earth. Now that neatly works as far as explaining the distances of the stars and so on. That's fine from that point of view. But we have a problem there with ideas like the supernova 1987. Because what that means is that God must have created the light just over, well over 100,000 years of light coming from the supernova to the Earth, and then put in that ray of light the information for a supernova which never really happened. Now that simply does not work. That is not the way that God operates. Scripturally, that's not the way that God operates. That concept of mature creation, you see, is not the same as saying if you were able to go back in a time machine and see Adam in the garden, that you think he looks 20 years old. That doesn't make God out to be deceptive, because we're actually told in Scripture that Adam had just been created, so that makes sense. But the idea of information being in the starlight on events that never actually happened doesn't really fit with the nature of God. And for that reason, we reject that model. The second model is known as the CDK model. And in this second model, we assume that the speed of light has actually changed. A couple of creation scientists looked at recorded values of the speed of light and said, look, they seem to be altering. Plotting them on a graph, they seem to suggest that the speed of light in the past was faster than it is today. Now, we also reject this theory these days, but not on biblical grounds. We reject it on scientific grounds. You see, the speed of light is actually a universal constant. For example, radioactive decay rates, they depend on the speed of light. So if the speed of light was faster in the past, then the radioactive decay rates would also have been faster in the past, which means that at the time of creation or before the flood, the radioactive decay rates would have been so great that radioactivity would have been too strong for life to live. So we reject the CDK theory on those grounds. Now that leaves us with two other ideas. And what we've seen then, if we look at the relationship between velocity and time and distance with the speed of light, what we've seen is that changing the velocity doesn't seem to work. Changing the distance doesn't seem to work, so what we're left with is changing the time. Maybe time itself is the variable. So the last two theories, theories 3 and 4, are both dependent on the idea that time may have changed. The third model is known as the alternate synchrony model, and this model has been developed by Dr. Jason Lisle. What we have in this particular model is the idea that there are perhaps different time conventions in different parts of the universe, time running in different rates in different parts of the universe. How does this occur? Well, it occurs because of the difficulty we have in trying to measure two things as simultaneous. How do I know, for example, that these two events happen simultaneously? It's because we see them happening simultaneously. The light has traveled to us the same speed. But if you're dealing with something on a cosmic scale, the only way that you can time two events being simultaneously is if you can synchronize chronometers at both places. That is not possible, because to move one chronometer to the other place to do the synchronization requires moving it, and therefore its time scale is altered according to Einstein's theory of relativity because of its very movement. So we actually have difficulty then in looking at how things synchronize in the universe. That's the third model. It's a little bit difficult to follow. The fourth model is known as gravitational time dilation. And this is personally the one that seems to make sense to me, though I think the jury's still out on models 3 and 4. Dr. Russell Humphreys developed really the gravitational time dilation model. The Big Bang theory is based on two assumptions. One, that the universe is infinite, and two, that the Einstein's theories of relativity are correct. Now, Russell Humphreys looked at Einstein's theories of relativity, suggested that they work. But what about the universe being infinite? Only God is infinite. So maybe the universe is not infinite. Maybe it's got a boundary, which of course is suggested in Genesis 1 by the idea of the universe expanding, the rakia expanding between the waters below and the waters above. If that happened then, it means that when God created the universe, it would have been a lot smaller. there would be, if there's a bounded universe, there's a net gravitational field towards the center. And one thing we know about that, even though it's counterintuitive, is that time runs at different rates in different gravitational fields. The greater the gravitational field, the slower time works. The less the gravitational field, the faster time moves. So if the universe was very small when God created it, as he began to expand it, Russell Humphreys has calculated that in one 24-hour period, that's day 4 of creation, if our galaxy is somewhere near the center, then 24 hours could have been going on in our galaxy and therefore on the Earth, while the equivalent of millions and millions of years worth of star development would have happened at the event horizon, thus neatly explaining how starlight can appear to have traveled across millions of light years, even though the universe is only 6,000 years old. Actually, despite all these complicated things we've said, the main purpose of the universe that God created is very simple. Psalm 19 tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God. And you know, when I think about that, I'm always moved towards one of the most beautiful passages of the New Testament, which is a couple of verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where it tells us something important about the universe that God made. It says this: "There are also celestial bodies and terrestrial bodies. But the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For one star differs from another star in glory."
Do you need the tools to defend your faith? Visit our websites for up-to-date content. Attend one of our live events. And shop online at creationstore.org. We are Creation Today.